Good morning. Welcome, English 1302. Happy Friday, and I hope you have a good Super Bowl weekend. I want to take just a moment and discuss with you the literary some of the vocabulary words, which includes both literary criticism and elements of formalism. All right, what is literary criticism, which we call lit crit? Literary criticism is a tool that the reader uses to understand a piece of literature better. When we talk about criticism, we're not talking about criticizing or finding fault with. We're talking about analyzing and examining it closely and really seeking to understand a piece of literature better. And of course, literary criticism has been around for a long time. There are different forms, they fall into different categories. One of the first ones is called formalism because it looks at the formal aspects of literary criticism. In fact, it's been around so long and it has gotten so involved that we set it aside and give it its own separate category, which we'll talk about in just a moment. There's also feminist theory, which examines a piece of literature based on the idea that the role of women in literature has been minimized, marginalized, or ignored. Now, this is both women characters and women authors. So, what does that mean? You look at a piece of literature, and if you see the role of a woman being minimized, marginalized, or ignored, you ask yourself, how would this story have been different if this character had not been treated this way? How would this be a different work of fiction if the character had been treated differently? Um, and it's often very revealing to look at this. Feminist theory is a very useful form of criticism. But the thing you have to remember is that not all of these, and there are one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. We're going to look at eight this semester, but not all of them can be used in every situation. And not every tool can be used with every short story. If you're building a house, you don't use a hammer for every single project. So if you're reading a short story and there's nothing but strong, empowered women in the story, then feminist theory would not be a useful tool. Also, remember that literary criticism is a tool that the reader uses. It's not something the writer puts in. Um, so anyway, then we have economic theory, which used to be called Marxist theory. Karl Marx got a bad rap, and then so they changed the name to economic theory. And it is attempting to understand literature based on the belief that everything we do in life, all human endeavor, is driven by money or a desire for power or position. Everything we do is based on a desire to get more money or power or authority. Very interesting. And it reminds us that the use of money can be very subtle and it's really interesting. And this one really does apply in a lot of short stories you read. You just have to kind of think about it. You have to kind of analyze how the characters could be using um, money. Now, let's talk for a moment about a word that's not on your list, verisimilitude. It's a fancy word which just means that we assume the things in the short story are real. If you read Harry Potter, it's about a boy who goes to a school of magic, Hogwarts. It's a wonderful book. I encourage you to read it if you haven't. Uh, but magic doesn't exist in our world, so we have to kind of open our imaginations and assume that it does exist in order for that story to make sense. Well, the same thing is true in every short story. You have to assume that the setting, the foundation laid out by the author is true and works, and then it goes from there. Okay, another form of literary criticism is called cultural studies. And now, cultural studies is so broad, we almost never use it because it can mean a lot of things in a lot of different situations. But cultural studies just basically ask the question, why are we looking at this piece of literature instead of something else? It asks the question if some short stories have been privileged while others have been ignored. Why did we study Shakespeare instead of Richard Burbage or Thomas Kidd or Thomas Lilly? Those were contemporary playwrights of William Shakespeare. Well, and the simple answer is yes. Some texts are studied more than others, sometimes because they are simply better. They convey more complex ideas more effectively. They speak to more people. They are, but a slightly more realistic answer, but that's all subjective. A slightly more realistic answer is that I teach Shakespeare because when I went to college, I was taught Shakespeare. And when my professor went to college, I'm sure he took Shakespeare. And so it's one of those things that just kind of perpetuates itself down through the ages. Historical criticism. Now, we've already done this. Before we read our play Macbeth, we took a look at the life and times of William Shakespeare. That's what historical criticism does. It asks how do the life and times of the author affect the work. And one of the things I emphasized in the life and times of William Shakespeare is that he probably didn't love his wife. He only left her the second best bed. He was tricked into marriage. They only had 3 kids. He lived most of his life a long way away from her. So he probably didn't love her. So therefore, in the play, many women are portrayed as witches, overly ambitious, like Lady Macbeth. Yeah, there aren't a lot of happy marriages in his play. You remember that from the video, of course. Um, we also look at, we also use psychological theory, and what this does is it uses um, theories based on psychology from famous psychologists. For example, the one we use most often in class is Freudianism. Sigmund Freud believed that everything we do in life is based on a desire for sex, so procreation. You have the Oedipal complex, and which basically says that all young men seek to be with their mothers and replace their fathers. Um, but yeah, a lot of what we do is based on a desire to procreate. Deconstruction is the best known school of postmodernism. You have a period of history, which includes literature and architecture and um, fashion design and a lot of things, which was called modernism up until about the 50s. And then anything pretty much after that is called postmodernism. Postmodernism and deconstruction came out of that. And it just basically asks, is anything real? It's kind of in contradiction to our idea of verisimilitude. But it asks, if, is anything real? Does anything have a stable existence? And what it does for us is it allows us to interpret pieces of literature differently and still be correct. There's a short story coming up, I think next week or the week after. It's called The Jewelry. And this young woman has some expensive jewelry, but the story never explains where it came from. She's a very poor young girl. She and her husband are barely getting by, but she has all this really expensive jewelry. Where does it come from? And so in class we talk about, well, maybe she had a lover, maybe she inherited it, maybe she stole it. There are many different ways of looking at it, but each one is correct as long as it pertains to the facts as laid out in the story. And ultimately, of course, it doesn't matter where the jewelry came from. The story is about the effects of the jewelry, not where she got it. But it's still a wonderful story. I hope you read it. Joy Guy de Maupassant. Another type of literary criticism is called reader response, which just basically says until somebody reads a short story, it doesn't exist. Now, that doesn't mean that unless I read a book, poof, it vanishes. It simply means that until my brain interprets these words, these words across the page, they're nothing but a bunch of black squiggles on a white page. But when I look at it and read it, then it takes meaning. And my brain interprets those meanings and connects them with other things which have meaning. And reader response basically says that each text is a conversation between the author and the reader. Okay, so it's the author talking to you and in your brain interpreting what he's trying to tell you and replying in your own head, not literally. Because each reader brings unique understanding and insights and experience to the story. Uh, Finally, there's new criticism, which focuses entirely on the text, um, because a lot of people say, well, you can't really understand this story until you read this story. You can't understand Harry Potter book 2 until you read book 1. But new criticism says that no, each text exists separately by itself. It argues that all politics, religion, and culture have nothing to do with the text, and it relies on close readings. Now, most of these rely on close readings. No, that doesn't mean holding the book close to your face. It means reading a story carefully, reading a story slowly, looking up words you don't know, and taking notes as you read the story. That will provide you with the very best understanding of the short story, and I highly recommend it for all of our short stories. But yeah, close reading and explication. Now, explication simply means explaining something with notes, explaining it with examples. Kind of what I've been trying to do here for you this morning is I'm trying to explain some of these terms and then give you a few examples, like the Life and Times of William Shakespeare. Um, okay, so those are the general forms of literary criticism we're going to talk about this semester. Then we have formalism. Now, formalism was the first one we talked about, and what formalism does is it looks at the formal elements. Well, you have to know what the formal elements are. Uh, antag the protagonist, that's the main character. It's the character that drives the action forward, the way the textbook says it, which we're not using this semester. The character that provides the impetus for the action, the character that causes things to happen. In most short stories, now short stories are so short. When you're looking at drama, when you're looking at novels, that's something different. But most short stories are so short that the protagonist is very clear. There's only one, and it can be very clear. If you're looking at Macbeth, you would say, well, is it Macbeth the protagonist or Lady Macbeth the protagonist? Do the witches, are they the ones who cause things to happen? They're the first characters we meet. But in most short stories, yeah, the protagonist is very clear. Then the antagonist is anyone or anything that works against the protagonist. Now, it can be another character in the story. It can be that character's own conscience. Maybe he feels bad about what he's done, like Macbeth's. It can be the forces of nature. A storm occurs. That can be antagonistic. Anyone or anything that works against the thing. Um, let's see, a foil, just like in drama, a foil is any character that highlights the characteristics of the main character through contrast. Okay. Um, um, Lady Macbeth was very ambitious. At one point, Macbeth himself was kind of ambivalent. He was kind of like, should I do this? Should I not? And she was so driven that she made his cowardice seem even worse. So that's a foil. The plot is just basically what happens in the story. The definition says the plan or groundwork for the story, the actions resulting from believable human responses to a conflict. Um, you have two types. Well, a character in a short story is a verbal representation of a human being. It's a person on paper. But then you have rounded characters and flat characters. Most characters in short stories are going to be flat characters. A character does not change during the course of the story. You usually have just one, sometimes two, rounded characters, also called dynamic characters, and these characters change during the course of the story. Now, don't forget, if a character dies during the short story, that's also a change, so that would make them a rounded character. The setting is both the time and place and in which the story occurs, and everything the characters know and use. A symbol. We don't get much into symbolism, um, but a symbol is where one thing represents something else. And the something else can be another thing, can be a person, can be an idea, can be a quality. You're probably, some students tell me, well, I don't really understand that, I don't really get it. You're probably, and yes, I'm using a new ring light this morning for better lighting. I'm not sure how well it's working, but uh, some students say, well, I don't really get it. You probably do. You just don't realize that you get it. You're probably more familiar with symbolism than you realize. You're driving down a highway and you see a sign that's got the big golden arches. You know that that's McDonald's. You're driving down University and you see a big red dot in the center of a white field. You know that's Target. These logos are a form of symbolism. Corporate logos, um, corporate branding are meant to make you, they're going to show you one thing, and they don't want you to go shop at the Dot or the Golden Arches. They want you to shop at Target or McDonald's or the store. Okay. The theme. A theme is something we're going to focus on this semester. The theme is the main idea of the story. and it's usually not stated. The author's not going to tell you what the main idea is because he wants you to figure it out. On your research papers, you have to state the main idea. It needs to be stated very clearly in one specific location, last sentence of the introduction. But in a short story, the author's not going to tell you because he or she wants you to read the story carefully and figure out what the main idea is. Plus, there's often more than one theme, and that theme can be stated in different ways. So we'll be talking about that from different time to time. Irony is where something happens in the story and it's the opposite of what you expected to happen. Sometimes you got a lively, vibrant character who's going along and doing great things, and all of a sudden he dies. Oop, that was unexpected. That's irony. Um, you can have, and that's called cosmic irony or irony of death. You can have situational irony. That's where the characters find themselves in a situation that they don't realize, but the reader does. Um, or verbal irony. Sarcasm is a good example, but that's where the character says one thing and means another thing. The last one for today, I know we're running long, an unreliable narrator. When you read a short story, you just automatically assume that the person telling the story is telling you the truth. Otherwise, why tell the story? And most of the time, that's exactly what happens. The narrator is telling you what actually occurred, but not always. When you read The Cask of Amontillado, I'd like you to consider the fact that maybe for one reason or another, the narrator is not telling us the exact truth. An unreliable narrator may hold a distorted view of events, which leads to an inaccurate retelling, can be not accurate or not credible due to the character's mental state or authority. Maybe he's too young to understand adult situations. Maybe he's drunk. There could be several reasons for the inaccurate retelling. But just ask yourselves, what if this is not really what actually really happened? Now, when you read A Rose for Emily, that one does not have an unreliable narrator. Well, okay, according to deconstruction, it could have, but according to most interpretations, according to most modern critics, it does not have an unreliable narrator. The events told are what actually happened. But that one has a special problem. It's called a stream of consciousness. The narrator, who is the town, it's not one person, the town narrates the story. They jump forward. They start at the funeral, her funeral, Miss Emily's funeral, and then they flash back, they flash forward, they flash back, they flash forward, flash back, and it jumps around a whole lot. And so you have to kind of it's helpful. When I read it, I had to construct a timeline and actually write down the events in which they happened. That might not hurt if you want to try something like that. But if you look at her appearance, that's the main way the author lets you know where you're at in the timeline, what she looks like. Because she starts off very small, very petite, very pretty, and then she gains weight and gets gray hair. And it has kind of an icky ending. But yeah, that's what happened. Okay. Okay. I hope that you will at least print these out. If not, write them out by hand. That's a better way of learning them. Kind of keep these with you. It's very helpful to have these. I'm about to post up right now something called Elements of Formalism, which it's just a list of those things we just went over, and then some blank space. And what it's meant for is for you to print them out every time you read a short story, 2, sometimes 3 a week, and then fill them out as you read the story. Again, it will help you to understand the story better by taking notes as you read it, and it will make studying for the next quiz much, much easier, and of course the final exam. So if you have any questions, let me know.